going to talk about reflections over the x and y axis. And we're talking about fractions and decimals. So remember that a fraction 1/2 and the decimal 0 5/10 represents a half space on our coordinate plane. So we're going to reflect A, 2 5/10 and -2 over the x-axis. So we're going to go right 2.5 and down 2. Start at 0, 0, 1, 2.5 is between 2 and 3, and then down 2, 1, 2. We label this point A. Since we're reflecting over the x-axis, take your highlighter and highlight the x-axis. The next step says to count the number of spaces away from the axis. So how many spaces are we away from the x-axis? 1, 2. 2 spaces. And we're going to count the other direction. So I went down, I'm going to count up this time. 1, 2. And label this A prime. So plot the point A prime in the reflection place and write the coordinates for A prime. So now it is 2.5, 2. And as we talked about in the previous video, 2.5 -2 was our original A. And when we reflect over the x-axis, the y coordinate becomes the opposite. The x value stays the same. So for example 2, we're going to graph it on the same coordinate plane. We're going to reflect B, -1 1/2 over the x-axis. So it's already highlighted. So we're going to go to the left, 1.5, and up 2. So I start at 0, 0, go to the left, 1.5, 1.5, and up 2, 1, 2. And we label this B. So now we're going to reflect over the x-axis. And we talked about earlier about what value changes. So when we reflect over the y-axis, what value is going to change? The y-axis will change. So our B prime is going to be -1.5, and 2 is going to be -2. Because B, our original, was -1.5, and our y was 2. Our x stays the same. When we reflect over the x-axis, our y becomes the opposite. So please graph that now. We stay at -1.5, and we're going to go down 2, 1, 2. And we label this B prime. So for example 1, we're going to reflect over the y-axis on the back here. We have reflect -3 5/10 1 over the y-axis. So that means we're going to go to the left, 3.5, and up 1. So let's graph Z first, please. 1, 2, 3.5 is between -3 and -4, and up 1. And we label that Z. Now we're going to graph Z prime over the y-axis. So take your highlighter and highlight your y-axis. Now I move to the left. I want to go the opposite way of the y-axis, so now I'm going to move to the right. The same distance, 1, 2, 3.5, and go up 1 for Z prime. So my new coordinates are 3.5, 1. Remember, Z, the original I graphed, was -3.5, 1. You can see now that my x value is changing and my y value stays the same when I reflect over the y-axis. When I reflect over the y-axis, my y value stays the same and my x becomes the opposite. For example 2, we're going to use the same coordinate plane. We're going to reflect x, which is 2, negative 3.5, over the y-axis. So it tells me to go right 2 and down 3.5. So I'm going to move to the right 2, 1, 2, and down 3.5. 1, 2, 3.5 is between negative 3 and negative 4. I plot the point x. I'm reflecting it over the y-axis. So that means I want to go the other direction. I went to the right, now I want to go to the left. So I'm going to go 1, 2 to the left, and I'm still going down 3.5. 1, 2, 3.5. And label that x prime. Now my coordinates are negative 2, negative 3.5. And my original coordinates for x were 2, negative 3.5. So once again, you can see that as I reflect over the y-axis, my y values stay the same, my x values are opposites. For example 3, we're going to reflect q, 2 5/10, and negative 3 5/10 over the y-axis. So that means we're going to go right 2.5 and down 3.5. So I start at 0, 0, and I go 1, 2.5, and I go down 1, 2, 3.5. And I label this Q. We are reflecting over the y-axis, so highlight your y-axis. So I wrote down my original coordinates for Q, 2.5, negative 3.5. I'm reflecting over the y-axis, so instead of going right now, I'm going to go to the left. So I'm going to graph it to the left, 1, 2.5, and then down 3. 1, 2, 3.5. And label that Q prime. So my coordinates for Q prime are negative 2.5, negative 3.5. Once again, I reflected over the y-axis. The y value stayed the same. The x becomes the opposite. You also see that my Q is on the same number for the y. 3.5 here and 3.5 here. Okay, for example 4, we're going to use the same coordinate plane right here. We're going to use x. It's going to be reflected. X is 2.5, 0 over the y-axis. So we're going to go right 2.5, and 0 tells us to stay. So I start at 0, 0, I'm going to go 2.5. 1, 2.5, and I plot my point. I stay right there, and I plot H. To reflect that, I'm going to go the opposite direction, 1, 2.5, and stay right there, and label it H prime. So now my new coordinates are 2.5, 0. Once again, as I reflect over the y-axis, my y value stays the same, and my x becomes the opposite. Important note to remember. When reflecting over the y-axis, the y value stays, and the x value is the opposite. So I reflect the h over the y-axis, the y value stayed 0, and 2.5, opposite of 2.5 is negative 2.5. So once we realize that we are reflecting over the, reflecting over the y-axis, the y value stays, the x value is the opposite. So when we're reflecting over the x-axis, when reflecting over the x-axis, the x value stays and the y value is the opposite. So when I reflected B, negative 1.5, 2, B prime is still negative 1 1/2, the x stays, and the y becomes the opposite.